The Why Me Project, an exclusive presentation of Faith Strong Today.
Holly, it's great because each and every week we have an opportunity to talk to somebody. And I mean, it's been 5 years and we're on 6 radio stations, different podcast platforms. And there's always somebody each week who's like, oh, you need to talk to insert person here.
Which I love because everyone has their own story. I love how everyone is so unique. I mean, God says He created everyone differently. We all have our own gifts and everyone has their own journey. And there is so much to learn from our brothers and sisters. So I'm really excited about today's conversation.
Yeah. So our guest this week, an activist, a writer, a storyteller, and oh so much more. Terence Lester, my friend, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about being here. Really grateful for each opportunity I get to just speak and meet new people.
The hardest question is usually the first one. And so we like to ask the skill testing question. Terence, who are you and where did you come from?
Yeah, so my name is Terence. I am from Atlanta, Georgia. And I like to think of myself as a person who is deeply committed to ensuring that people who are unseen and unheard are made visible and have an opportunity to have their voices heard. And so I'm a servant leader.
Were you born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia?
I was born and raised. I'm not a transplant. I've been here my entire life. I grew up here, and this is where my family stays right now. So I have a wife of almost 16 years, and I have 2 beautiful kids. My daughter's name is Zion. She just made the JV soccer ball team. So
nice.
And my son's name is Terence II. So the world has 2 of us.
Nice.
What was life like growing up in Atlanta and area?
Yeah, I mean, life was very hard. I am a Black male growing up in the Deep South in a city that is considered the Black Mecca of the United States of America, as it has many historical factors and features of this great city. I mean, a lot of the civil rights movement was birthed here. Martin Luther King's father pastored a church. He was a pastor at a church here. I have many friends who were kind of reared in the Atlanta way of doing things, which Atlanta is totally different now culturally, because there are a lot of people traveling to this city and moving here. But yeah, I mean, life was hard. I grew up in very urban area, a part of town, but it also contained, great sense of cultural and family values, right? Where I got a chance to see my grandmother and my grandfather maintain their marriage for 70 years.
Wow.
Until my grandfather passed a few months ago. I got a chance to, be a part of family reunions with my grandfather. He was kind of like an organizer of always wanting to get the family together. I grew up watching my grandmother cook in the kitchen and kind of adopted that as a hobby. It's kind of like what I do right now as a stress reliever. And yeah, I mean, all of the statistics that you would think of growing up Black and male. But I had a loving mother who showed me tough love very early on. And people get a chance to see a lot of the fruit of that today.
Incredible. It's always interesting hearing from the Atlanta area, talking about being Black in America. We are Canadian, and so it's a little different here, but you still deal with some of those situations. And so, for you over the years, have you noticed a positive change in how the community unites together, and just your experience being a Black man in America?
We've seen a lot of advancement in terms of Black culture. We've seen more Black films hit the airways with, some of the cast having leading roles that are Black. We've seen a lot of persons kind of have this access to upward mobility, but in essence, there is a large part of Black America that still deals with the residue from systemic injustice that has been done to Africans in America over the last, 400, 500 years. And so it's unique to see and celebrate all of the achievement, all of the Black joy, all of the access and the representation that we see, while still realizing that there's so much work to do. I mean, we're just coming off the tale of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and situations that happened literally in the pandemic that uncovered much disparity in the United States and around the world, but also it uncovered a lot of the deeply rooted racism that still exists here in our country.
You talk about your grandparents being great role models for relationships. You talk about mom showing you tough love. Do you think it's mama's tough love the reason why you are the man you are today?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of my grandmother. I had a really close relationship with my grandmother when I was a lot younger. I recently learned later on in life that my dad at the time was in jail, and my grandmother kind of embraced me and started taking me to church, kind of stepping in. She would take me to the historic Wheat Street Baptist Church, which is also a part of the civil rights movement here in the city of Atlanta. And we used to sit in the back, and I was 9 years old. And I remember my grandmother figuring out that I needed glasses because she would point to someone in the choir that I couldn't see. And she would talk about the preacher preaching and what it really meant. And I saw my grandmother serve in various capacities. My family also faced a lot of hardships and dynamics. Like my mother and father obviously separated, divorced, and I grew up without a father in my home. And so there were times when there were gaps in my development where I was trying to figure things out. And my mom, being a Black woman, was trying to do the best she could, work multiple jobs and also take care of my sister and myself. And many times I missed the moments to really understand why she was being so tough on me until later in life, realizing that she was pushing me to become a strong man that would be representative of what a Black man should be in the context of our family. So I am very grateful to my mother. And I think the way that our story plays out, she did the best that she could, doing everything, being resilient, and also trying to take care of two roles in the household as mother and father, and also provide and push a young man to not succumb to his environment. So when I look back, she's a hero.
Oh, that's incredible. I mean, shout outs to the single moms. My mom was a single mom as well. And talk about just the pressure of providing for your family and wanting to be there, but you got to take care of the grocery bills and everything. Did you find growing up in that environment more pressure to do what was right? Or were there moments where you just wanted to say, you know what, I don't want to break that cycle?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of all of those things. So like growing up, you're really trying to figure out what does it mean to be a young Black male, having the talk with, coaches and your uncle. And if you don't know what the talk is kind of like a rites of passage that Black parents have to have with their children or Black grandparents to prepare them for a world where they will be targeted and or treated differently from law enforcement or for walking in stores or whatever, right? And so I can remember as early as age 8 having my mom tell me that if I was to walk in a store, keep my hands out of my pocket, or if someone comes up to me and they ask me what I'm doing, if I'm buying something, visibly show the money, or if I get pulled over, to stick my hands out of the car when I start driving, or keep my hands at 10 and 2. And all these different ways of how, trying to understand how to be, and then you're dealing with the complexities of the environment. You know, you see poverty everywhere. You see, you know, your peers struggling, their families are struggling, and there's not a lot of tangible examples of what it means to overcome this. And so you're wrestling with this dichotomy of this is normal, but no, this isn't normal. It wasn't until I was 20 years old. I had dropped out of high school, went back as a fifth year senior. It was the most embarrassing time of my life. And I did it because I had met this guy experiencing homelessness on the street. He pulled me aside one day. He was like asking me, did I go to this school? It was an alternative school. Right now, I lead an organization called Love Beyond Walls, and our organization actually supports students that goes to that school, and it's less than a mile away. This is the very school that I stopped going to, right? And this guy tells me, one day you're going to be a leader, and, you know, just started talking to me about some random stuff that I had no clue why he would be talking to me about this, but it was in the company of some of my friends. And so I walked away. And it was that in that moment, I got the courage to go back to school. I finished school, go off to college because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and got in trouble at college. I was literally in a jail cell at age 20 when this guy who had gotten locked up for, I think he had left his driver's license somewhere. He got pulled over and they took him to jail. He was actually deeply involved in the church, and his dad was a pastor. And so I'm in this cell with him, and he's talking to me about, like, what am I doing here? And like talking to me about like the gospel and like telling me about God's love. And I'm like, dude, like we're in trouble, you know? And long story short, I mean, he shared his faith with me. He had gotten out before I did. The next morning, my mom came down. We go to court, and this judge is just handing out like sentences. It's a small rural town, so there's obviously some hints of racism there. And he gets to me. He calls me up. It's this huge crowd, and my mom is sitting there, and he's looking at me, and he's looking at my mom. He's looking at me, and he says, I don't know why I'm going to do this today, but I'm looking at your mom and I'm going to give you a second chance. And he drops all the charges. When I leave there, I come back to Atlanta, just trying to figure out, God, like, what do you want me to do with my life? And my friend at the time called me. He was like, man, I'm going to this Bible study. He was like, I like this girl that goes to this church. Would you just come? He wasn't even in church. He just wanted me to go.
Yeah.
I was like, all right. And so I go with him to church. We're sitting in this room, and it's a small little men's group, and women are separated. And he was just waiting till this was over. But I was really listening, right? And I gave my life to the Lord right there that night. And then from there, I got plugged into a church, and I started meeting all of these men who were like older in age, and started sharing my story. And somehow I got connected to ministry and got involved in leadership, and had people pay for me to go to college, pay for my wedding. I started to discover parts of who I was. And when I look back, I started to see that all of those broken pieces served a greater purpose. And so that's how I got to where I am.
So you had mentioned it before about Love Beyond Walls. A movement of doers is what I love, and creating a world where no one is invisible. How did you come up with this idea, this concept, this organization?
I got involved in ministry. I went to Bible college, obtained a few degrees, and then I was serving on staff at a church, and I was kind of frustrated. And every day I would go into my office. I was youth and young adult leader. I would walk out to the edge of the street, and the building wasn't being used all throughout the week, only just like on a Sunday or if somebody had a practice in the middle of the week. And I was like, this is where all the action is. I need to be where the action is. And I became really frustrated with just like being constricted, because I felt like God had allowed me to overcome so much in my life. And a lot of the people that I would be able to relate to would never come to the church, right? Or never like enter into the doors. We always talked about how love was powerful. And I started to think, well, what if we take that love beyond walls? And so my wife and I, started going downtown underneath bridges, because a part of my story too is when I was 16 and a half years old, I experienced homelessness. I was sleeping in parks and like over friends' houses, and teachers didn't understand why I would fall asleep in class, not understanding like I was getting dressed out of the trunk of my car and all that. And so we started just building relationships with people in the heart of the city. And I'll never forget, I was having breakfast with one of my friends. His name was Kurt. He lived behind an abandoned building in the heart of the city. And for the first time in 3 months, Kurt told me his story. He says, "You want to know how I became homeless?" I was like, yeah. He says, "I was in a car accident and I lost my wife and my kid, and I was the only one to survive. I started drinking alcohol and I could no longer function on my job. I lost everything and I ended up back here." And I'm like, yo, let me try to, use some of my contacts to get you off the streets. And he was like, "I don't want to stay in the shelter. There's a shelter about 2 miles away. It has 500 men that sleep in chairs and it's only one restroom." He says, "As a matter of fact, I probably won't get any sleep because I'll be staying up all night trying to protect everything I own and possess in this bag." He says, "I bet you if you go and live there, you probably would be on the backside of this building with me because it's more comfortable outside than it is in some of our shelters." And I'll never forget that. I rode all the way home, got home. It was November, so it was starting to get really cold. The temperature was starting to drop, and I'm sitting at dinner with my wife, my kids, my 2 young kids at the time. My wife goes, "What's wrong? Something's obviously wrong with you." And I say, "Kurt challenged me today. Like, he said I should live on the streets." Now, Kurt had no knowledge that I had lived like this when I was a teenager. I told my wife, I said, "I believe God wants me to like walk in the shoes of people that, we were serving." She says, "What do you mean?" I said, "I think I'm supposed to make myself homeless and live on the streets." And she says, "What?"
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And she says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Yeah, just like if with your permission, kids' permission, I would just live on the streets." Long story short, my wife dropped me off underneath a bridge I think probably 4 or 5 days before Christmas. And my family allowed me to live on the streets for a little over a month. And so
Wow.
ate out of trash cans, begged for money, was put out of shelters, documented the entire experience, and using that time to advocate and bring attention to the realities of what people suffer through when they are on the other side of the experience of homelessness. Burn donated clothes that people brought underneath bridges and use them as firewood because there was no firewood. Having to walk tons and tons of miles to try to figure out how you're going to use the restroom, or being put out of restaurants because you asked for a cup of water, or having business professionals walk across the street, or shelter workers telling me, "Don't get mad because you chose this life," not even realizing that I wasn't actually homeless at that moment. And so that was the start of Love Beyond Walls. At the end of that campaign, I had built such great relationships and used technology to tell these stories. We ended up getting about 12 people off of the streets underneath the bridge, reuniting people with family members, connecting them to programs. And that was kind of the origin of Love Beyond Walls, what it means to take Love Beyond Walls and be present and proximate with people who society deems invisible.
It's amazing to think that one missed paycheck or one incident where a car accident really could be that difference between someone being homeless and someone not being homeless. And I think a lot of us live under that false pretense that, oh, we're fine, it's fine, that would never happen to us. And yet it could, and compassion sometimes just seems to be lacking overall. For you, what has been a moment where you thought, yes, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is the sweet spot. This is what God intended for me to do.
In the moment of being underneath the bridge, having so many people have the scales fall off their eyes, so to speak, as it relates to the false perceptions of what it means to be without an address. because homelessness itself is not monolithic. Everybody has their own story, how they arrived into the plight. And many times there are myths that persist about what it means to be poor and or without an address. I wanted to create this sense of educational awareness, but also creating community around individuals that we really build relationships with. Because for me, I remember Mr. Moore, talking to me when I was living out of my car in a park, which was my friend's father, who told me that God had a purpose for my life and that I would be a leader one day. And I remember standing at Mr. Moore's funeral when he passed away, looking into the audience as I was able to say words and realized that Mr. Moore lived his life in a way that was proximate and present with the people who were overlooked in society. And so that's kind of like the core and the heartbeat of what it means to be a part of a movement of doers. What does it mean to be doers of the word or doers of goodness in the world instead of just like theorizing and sitting around talking about it? I mean, having that tangible presence can make a world of difference. We've seen people who were families living in cars get stable housing. We've seen brothers who were out of touch with their children for a number of years be reunited with their children. We've seen people who went from corporate America down to absolutely nothing, get rehired again. I've seen people get access to their identification cards, and all in the context of what it means to bring people together, which is my core message, that we can do more together against the ills that plague our communities than we can apart.
Love Beyond Walls was started what year?
It was started in 2013.
So from day one of 2013 to where you are now, how have you seen change and growth within the organization?
Man, we've gotten over 500 people off the streets. We've mobilized thousands, tens of thousands of people. Here recently, we launched a campaign called Love Sinks In, putting hand washing stations out in the streets for people experiencing homelessness to have access to hand washing, because that was one of the critical things. We started in the city of Atlanta, and now we have hand washing stations in 72 cities across the country. I've gotten the chance to launch the first museum in the United States that represents homelessness out of a shipping container called Dignity Museum.
Yeah.
We've educated a lot of people. We've done documentaries. Here recently, I just released 2 books centered around the things that I talk about often to groups of people. One is called I See You, How Love Opens Our Eyes to Invisible People. And the other one is When We Stand, The Power of Seeking Justice Together. Currently, I'm working on a children's book related to homelessness to educate young people about what it means to see others, that every single person has worth and value, regardless of their social location. I like to also say that people without an address are our neighbors, right? Just because someone doesn't have an address does not mean that they're not our neighbor. And I like to talk about what it means to be about the whole community. Going forward, I'm hoping that Love Beyond Walls continues to fight against ordinances and laws that criminalize what it means to be homeless, or educate more people about how they can tangibly take actionable steps in the context of their community. It doesn't just have to be Atlanta, but all across the country. And to continue to create innovative campaigns that will cause people to think of how to repurpose and reimagine how we use excess around us to actually solve issues and problems, which is one of the things that we've done really well.
This is the Why Me Project podcast, so it is that time. We reflect on your life. Is there any moments where you asked, why me? Whether it's in a valley, things weren't going so well, or a mountaintop?
I had launched this campaign with Love Beyond Walls where I lived on top of a bus that was donated to our organization for a month in a little tent, because I wanted to retrofit it to create a mobile barbershop and shower for people experiencing homelessness. And at the end of the campaign, we mobilized about 500 people to get involved. And I didn't know where we would get barbers and beauticians. And somebody saw the story on the news and reached out to us and said, hey, there's this barber school. I go up to the barber school. Barber instructor introduces us to this guy named Jamil. Jamil was 27. He comes, starts to volunteer and cut hair on our bus and help us groom people experiencing homelessness. And I asked him, I said, Jamil, why are you doing this? He says, because I haven't seen my dad in 10 years because he's homeless, and I'm hoping to one day run into him. Well, 3 months later, we ran into Jamil's father. He was able to make his own father over on the bus. And to date, his dad has been in the program and has been off the streets for a little over 4 years. And that's kind of like a why me moment, because sometimes I get visions about things to do that may be really radical, but they have a greater purpose when I yield myself to just serving humanity.
As we always say, before you judge, you walk a mile in a man's shoes. And this man did so at Love Beyond Walls and at I'm Terence Lester on all the socials. Terence, my friend, appreciate you taking some time and sharing your heart today.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you all.
It really is true, though, Holly. If you want to know where someone's come from, walk a mile in their shoes. And he did that. And I mean, hats off, because it's just, I would love to say, oh, yeah, I would totally do it. And then I would last a day, not a month.
I am just so impressed with his resolve to do what he can to make a positive change in his community and beyond. And he has such a calm demeanor. You can tell that he is walking in what God called him to do. He's just at peace with it. And I loved this conversation.
Well, and it's good because it's like, oh, yeah, so you created this this organization. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I also did this museum. Oh, by the way, I also wrote 2 books. Oh, by the way, I'm also doing a kid's book. I'm like, yeah, I put my shoes on this morning and I was really excited.
What have I done with my life? We can't compare, though, as God has different plans for all of us. And I'm so excited for what he has in store for Terence and his family as well. Yeah. I can only imagine his kids seeing what he's doing and how that is really creating some incredible leaders for this next generation.
Thank you to Nathaniel for sending in the idea of talking to Terence today. whymeproject@outlook.com. Find us on all the socials, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or the Twitter. And then we also have all the places for our podcast, Holly.
Yeah, absolutely. So wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you look for us, Why Me Project. And of course, head to faithstrongtoday.com.